Good afternoon. Thank you very much for connecting to our seminar today. I hope you are all well and that you're all staying safe at your homes. My name is Eric Parrado. I am the Chief Economist at the Research Department at the Inter-American Development Bank. And for those who are joining us for the first time, this seminar is part of the seminar series that our Research Department organizes. It is called EconNet. And given the new reality due to the pandemic, we have adopted this online format, and most of our upcoming seminars, including the one today, will be covering COVID-related topics that are relevant for the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. Today, we will have Laura Alfaro, Warren Alpert Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. We are really happy to have Laura with us today. She holds many positions at different research and policy institutions, including the NBER and the IFC, among others. And between 2010 and 2012, Laura served as the Minister of National Planning and Economic Policy in Costa Rica. Today, she will be presenting her paper on aggregate and firm-level stock returns during the pandemics in real time. As you probably know, Laura has made important contributions to the literature on international capital flows and foreign direct investments, among other topics, which have influenced the policy discussion in LAC countries. Today in particular, Laura will talk about how unexpected changes in the trajectory of COVID-19 infections predict US stock returns in real time. But before passing her the microphone, let me go quickly through the rules that we have adopted of our seminar. They are really simple. There will be no breaks for questions during the seminar. The speaker will have 40 minutes to present, and then we will have the remaining time for Q&A. During the presentation, you have the option to type your questions in the chat, and Victoria Nuger, one of our research economists, will be the moderator, and she and I will be the only ones who will have access to them. In the end, we may choose some of the questions to ask to the speaker. And afterwards, of course, we will make sure the speaker have access to all of them. During the Q&A session, you will need to use the option raise your hand to, and to wait until we give you the permission to speak. In this case, remember that you will need to turn on your microphone. Now, with further ado, let me pass the microphone to Laura Alfaro. Laura, thank you very much for being with us today. The microphone is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I do apologize in case you hear a little dog in the background. We just got a dog, and I think the dog is beating my husband and my daughter in terms of rules and who's in charge. So let me share the presentation. Okay. So as was mentioned, the name of our paper is Aggregate and Firm Level Stock Returns During Pandemic in Real Time. This is co-author work with Anusha Chari, who's joining us here, and Andrew Greenland and Peter Schott. Let me start by mentioning that this is very preliminary work, and we do appreciate your comments and feedback. It's very preliminary, not only because this is unfolding as we speak, but also some of the data is not even available due to the lags in reporting, and so we're trying to complement with additional sources. So let me start with the motivation. And it has become recurrent, this discussion on how the stock market is doing. Today in particular is not doing great, although I haven't checked recently, in part due to many concerns. One seems to be that in the US cases are picking up. But most of the discussion on the evolution of the stock market relates not only to how quickly it recovered and how well it's doing, but mostly in comparison to how the unemployment numbers have been progressing. So the stock market has recuperated while unemployment continues to be a concern. And so what we argue related to these concerns about the relation on the stock market and the labor market is that, as we know, COVID-19 is in many ways an unprecedented shock. In my household, we have a joke that every time we hear that COVID-19 is unprecedented, we take a shot. So if you're playing this game as well, go ahead. But it is in many ways an unprecedented shock. And in general, the standard asset pricing models don't tend to do well when there is a lot of volatility, a lot of uncertainty, simply because of the fact that it's just very hard to forecast cash flows and discount rates. But here we're also in the presence of a very different type of shock. And so we want to understand how information in pandemic is incorporated into asset prices. And we start by this fact: it is a different type of shock. It is a health shock. So we want to zoom in what is particular and characteristic about this current problem. And we want to take the trajectory of the disease as the main variable we need to consider, because the ratio of noise to signal is disproportional in terms of the information that may be conveyed through the progression of the disease, the cases. And we're going to relate these to changes in the stock prices. So the way we're going to approach this is we're going to calculate a disease model, a progression of the disease, and compare it to stock market returns. And in particular, the way we're going to do this is we're going to take very simple infection processes, exponential logistic, and I'll go in more detail to the logic. We want to estimate and underestimate parameters each day, given the information we have of the cases up to that date. We then are going to use these parameters to predict the number of cases for the next trading day. And we're going to calculate this difference between the predicted and the new information that gets revealed. And we're going to calculate this difference that is going to be, if you want, the news. And so we're going to examine how the stock market on day T reacts to these changes, to this news. And we're going to relate these to firm level and aggregate results. And in particular, what we find is that unanticipated changes in these predicted infections based on daily estimations plays an important role in forecasting the stock market. And this is something that we have done so far for COVID-19, and in particular the US, but we also did it for a previous pandemic, which was the case of SARS in 2003. So to go into a little bit more detail of some of our findings, we do find that large increases in model predictions are associated with the greater declines in the stock market. We can find that in the US, when we see some doubling of the cases, we do see between 4 and 10% reductions or declines in the stock market. We're going to use the Wilshire because it gives us more availability of firms. We find similar patterns when we do this to SARS. So in both cases, declines in this prediction are associated with increases in the stock market. We also find substantial cross-industry variation and in terms of exposure. So what we argue is that the investors are updating their beliefs as they update the information and they update the process behind the disease. So once it stabilizes and it becomes clear the type of process, we argue that the equity market may recover, and these provide a potential explanation for that recovery that we saw in April. And again, extrapolating for our paper because we haven't done it, but it may also forecast a reduction if the cases again start to increase and that the disease develops its second wave. We then zoom into firm and industry level results. And so we identify this channel of exposure and we look how this channel of exposure co-varies in terms of different variables at the firm and industry with firm and industry characteristics. In general, we find that 90% of firms react negatively to these unexpected changes in infection. We find, as I mentioned, a lot of variation across industries. In particular, we have industries such as transportation, entertainment, and hospitality to display largest decline. These tend to be industries where physical contact is important, while we find less in industries that require less this physical presence, education, professional services, and finance. We also find that less profitable, more capital intensive, and more indebted firms tend to display the largest declines in value. And we zoom into this result to try to understand a little bit more of this result. And we advance in the paper. These results are a bit more preliminary, and I'll explain why it's mostly due to data availability. But we tend to find that industries with higher capital to labor ratio exhibit less changes in employment. We'll replicate this at the county and the state level to look at exposure, if you want a geographical exposure of COVID. And we find that states with bigger declines in value also exhibit some of these changes in terms of labor growth. And so the way we bring together this puzzle between Main Street and Wall Street is that investors are penalizing firms that are unable to shed costs. And this view of what is the difficulty of shedding costs may be associated with relatively a lot of capital, or the capacity to be able to reduce labor costs. So in a way, our results are also arguing that the investors are perceiving this shock to be a reallocation shock, where some adjustment is necessary, and firms that are able to shed some costs tend to have a lower negative effects, if you want. There is, in terms of related literature, and I'll go quickly here given the time constraints, we know that there is a very long literature in terms of asset pricing, Campbell, Fama, and we relate to this work. More recently, there's a lot of work that is being done looking at financial market effects, at the channels of exposure, and also looking at labor market effects. How we differ from these papers is, as I mentioned, we're zooming on what we argue is the characteristic of this shock, which is the progression of the disease. And we're gonna take that and see how investors are looking at the progression of the disease and how that affects stock market returns. As I mentioned, our paper is preliminary. So far, we have a section that explains how we model the disease, the infection of disease, and how we go from the disease to the economic impact. We apply it to COVID-19, where we're looking at aggregate US returns. Then we look at firm level, and we have a spatial implementation in terms of employment. And then at the end of the paper, we discuss how this also maps well to the previous pandemic in SARS. Let me start by some just terminology and assumptions. The market value of a firm J at time T is given by MVJT. Infections on day T are revealed at the end of the day when the market closes. I don't know if all of you are watching governor of your state. In fact, apparently there's a joke among kids that the pandemic has meant that all the kids now know the name of their governor. So depending if you're in Massachusetts or in New York and so on, usually the cases are being reported at the end of the day. So we're gonna see that the market value is going to depend on the expected series of cases. And when there is an increase, this might correlate with larger declines because there's a belief that there's gonna be greater supply shock impact, greater demand impact, or even financial. Because of the timing, trading on day T relies on the cases being reported on the day before at the end of the day. So the forecasting is going to take into account this different timing between when the cases are reported and when one starts trading. So we're going to have the forecast available during the trading yesterday, and CT-2, the forecast available before we start today. And we're going to look at the changes in this information. So this would be the unanticipated change in the case growth. In the empirics, we play a little bit with this timing in case some information was leaked before and so on and so forth. But our results are robust to changing or accounting for small differences in the reporting. And so we're going to look at the information, the news, this unexpected growth in the cases, and we argue that this is going to affect stock prices. And in general, we have this expectation that this is going to affect it negatively. There's an unexpected change or increase in the cases, we expect a negative effect. So to undertake this exercise, we need to take a stand on infections. And we are very open in the paper. We're not epistemological. We don't know beyond what everyone has picked up recently. But what we argue is that the more complex models which have been using, if you go back to January, February, March, the information required in terms of who's susceptible, the rate of infection, and so on, was just not well known. So the amount of information that was required to be able to use this information, it was not well known, and it's complex. I have another paper with several co-authors that we're trying to think a little bit more endogenous about these models. But because of these difficulties in the information that was needed and the knowledge that existed of the disease in February, March, we argue that simpler growth models, which have been also used in biology to model infection and mortality, may be more relevant. And this would be the exponential and the logistic. They require less information and knowledge about the disease to be able to create estimates. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to estimate exponential and logistic models, and we're going to apply it to the US. So again, very simple. One can have an exponential model where C is the cumulative number of cases at day T. That is going to be a function of the growth rate and the initial number of people infected. That's an exponential. In the logistics, we're going to have a K that is the carrying, C is the shift parameter, and we're also going to have a growth rate. And in this case, higher growth rates in the logistic means that you would reach the capacity faster, and also you're going to peak at a higher level. And so just to give you a simple example, here is a case where K is 250, the C is 50, and we plotted for different growth rates. And again, that higher will give you, you reach faster and you reach a higher level. When we estimate the logistics and the exponential, a couple of things happen, which are expected ones. The estimation is very sensitive to the initial values, and this is expected with few cases. Few cases are consistent with many estimations. So what we do here is we're going to estimate 500 models, 250 of each. We're going to use different vectors, and we're going to have a grid of the prior day estimates, just to deal with the fact that it might be sensitive to the starting choice. Another issue is that it may fail to converge. And again, this also depends on how quick the disease progresses. The logistic may not converge. And this is, again, an example showing this. We run a logistic. We assume that the process is logistic. We run it for 200 days. And as you see early on, the logistic just doesn't converge. The exponential has this issue that as the days progress, it just starts to either try to match it with very large or very low numbers, given that it cannot match the fact that the disease eventually is going to converge. So just to put a little bit more, so here's where we're estimating the predictive cases, and we're going to compare the logistic with the exponential. And so around 104 days, they actually tend to converge. After that, we see differences in terms of the logistic and exponential, again, associated with this issue that is not being able to match as the disease progresses. So we're gonna take these disease models into economic impact. And as I said, we're gonna assume that the change in the forecasts of the T-1 and T-2, this news, which is taken as an unexpected change in how severe the outbreak has been, is going to have effects in the stock market. So we're gonna examine aggregate and firm level returns. So far we have done it for the US. We use the data from the Johns Hopkins Resource Center. The first case in the US was in January 20 announced, and the WHO announced, declared this a pandemic in January 22. This is just to give you a sense of how these estimations work. Again, if one starts to track this or estimate based on information on February 29, one is going to severely underestimate the potential cumulative cases. As information progresses, and in particular when there are big changes in the number of diseases, there's going to be changes in the expected number of cases. And this is the information that we're gonna try to explore. These severe changes in the number of revealed cases versus forecasting. And so let me go in detail. This has the reported cases in the US starting in January 20 up to April 15. Oh, I gave away the next one. So this is the predictive cases. This is the reported cases in gray. This is in red, the predicted with the information available in T-1. This is the predicted in T-2. So they look very close because there's going to be a relation, but the difference does show, and we plot here the scale, that there are some days where there are substantial changes in the news. And this is the information that we're gonna use, these changes in the cases. And if you see around this time, it starts to level off, which is when the disease starts to take a more stable, if you want, growth. And let me, I don't know if this can be seen, but here we're plotting that change in the forecast against the number of actual cases. And below, we're plotting our change in this number of cases against the stock market. And I don't know if you can notice that once this change starts to stabilize, the stock market starts to improve. To see this in more detail, here we plot the stock market, the change in the stock market, the Wilshire index, on our change in cases, unexpected growth case. And as you can see, there's a negative relation with these two. When there's higher expected cases, the stock market does worse. As this starts to stabilize and there's a positive news in terms of the disease containment or pattern, the stock market tends to do better. So we take this a little bit further and we run this regression on the stock market and the change, the news, and we are different controls. We're running this regression between January 22 and 410, and we're gonna run it for each firm. So we're gonna have 4,007 estimates. We also do this at 6-digit and 4-digit NAICS code. And so the first column shows again this result, this negative relation. I'm presenting here with the market closes. In the paper also, we present the different timing of the case. And again, a negative and significant relation. Then we adjust for the number of trading days, we get similar result. As I mentioned, we just check if perhaps some information was leaked or there are differences in the timing. Our results are consistent. We also control for the index of stringency. This is an index created by the Oxford University that looks at the different measures that were created to contain the disease. We don't find this variable to be significant when we do it at the aggregate level. Perhaps this is not surprising. Most of the policies had a lot of geographical variation, and in fact, when we disaggregate more geographically, we do find this variable to play a role. We also, so far, have added that fiscal stimulus that was taken at that time. We don't find a significant effect. Again, this doesn't mean that policy may not play a role. It just seems to be that at this moment, the progression of the disease was the main concern in terms of the market. We are doing additional robustness checks in terms of policy variables. We then look at the daily return for each firm. We're gonna do this in terms of the firm exposure, and we're gonna look at the unexpected changing cases, and we also control for market, just to see if there is some variation beyond and above the covariance with the market. Again, the same sample period. We take data from Bloomberg and Yahoo Finance, not Finance. I just found the typo there. And again, we're going to run this for each firm. And so we have 4,070 estimates. And this just shows the distribution of the estimates. This is the market. This is the distribution for firm. And as you can see, for most of our firms, the effects have been negative, and also negative in relation to the market. Here we show the results at the industry level, and we rank them a little bit. And so what we can see is that sectors in general that have a lot of high contact tend to do worse than sectors that have relatively less contact required to perform activities. There's also variation related to mining and agriculture in terms of what was considered essential and not essential. But again, we do see this difference in terms of industry level results. We later find that industry plays an important role in terms of some of these effects. So we take this and we're going to run a series of firm regressions, again, the firm exposure against different pre-pandemic attributes. And so we're going to look at total assets minus property, plant, and equipment, employment, operating profits, cash, and debt. And in general, we tend to find that firms with higher capital, if you want, tend to relatively have more negative effects. And again, these we do it. We do assets, and then we do assets minus PP&E. So we play with these estimates, while firms with large employment tend to have less negative effects, if you want, relative. And so the way we interpret this is that the market seems to be punishing relatively more firms that seem to be less able to adjust to this shock because they have a lot of capital, because they're less flexible. Firms also that have a lot of debt seem to perform a little bit worse than the rest. As I mentioned, a lot of these, there's an important industry effect. When we control for industry effect, it dominates, and also our R-squares increase substantially, which we take to be that again, there is a very important industry type component associated with the type of shock that this is, a health shock, and also that investors believe that larger firms are better positioned to adjust to some of these shocks. Again, our hypothesis behind these results is that there's a punishment of firms that are perceived to be less able to adjust. And consistent with this, we find this relation that firms with relatively more capital than labor also there's a negative relation with the effect in terms of the market value. Again, it's consistent with this, that it becomes difficult to adjust. And some view that this is more of a reallocation shock than just simple a neutral transitory shock. And so in the later part of the paper, we want to understand this relation between capital and labor. One issue we're facing is that the employment level, the employment data is still not available. In fact, it just it was made available, and we're gonna update the paper. Instead, what we use is jobless claims as a proxy of employment and unemployment. This data is available across states. And also we're gonna look at changes across industries. So we're gonna exploit jobless claims, exploiting geographical heterogeneity across the US and industry heterogeneity. And so to do that, we calculate, if you wanna, a weighted average of the COVID-related shock or change in the market value for each industry. The way we're gonna do this is we're gonna take for each US county, we're gonna look at the change in the market value, and we're gonna weight by employment at the industry and county level. And we're gonna weight by the change in the market value of the firm. And we're gonna compare this market value adjusted with jobless claims. And so this looks at this geographical exposure of the labor market in the US. Redder are more negative. And so it seems that a lot of the industries in the Texas and Midwest and so on seem to be more negatively affected. Through the eyes of how we're interpreting the result is this view that they may be relatively less able to adjust to shed workers, while there is more capacity to shed workers or take advantage of again, less contact industries in the coastal areas. This just shows the cumulative jobless claims for workers per state exposure. And again, this shows this relation that the market reacts worse when there is relatively less jobless claim, and penalizes a little bit less when there's relatively more of these jobless claims. And so we examine this further by running this regression on the jobless claims to employment in the state, the week data. We're going to use, if you want, a diff and diff, compare after March 18, which is the official date of the pandemic. We're gonna look at the change in the market value. We're gonna control for different variables that may affect this at the industry level. In particular, this index created by Dingell and co-authors of the industries that are more amenable to teleworking or not, and we're gonna control for capital and labor. And so, again, through the eyes of how we're interpreting these results, we again see this positive relation that if firms have some capacity to shed workers, the market is penalizing them less. So we see a consistent positive and significant result this result is there even when we control for firms that are more or less able to do telework. And if an industry if a firm belongs to an industry that relatively can do more telework, the market is penalizing them less. In this case, when we disaggregate the stay order policies at the more local level, we do find a positive effect in terms of jobless claims. And we add additional variables to try to control for employment at the state level and workforce. But again, we argue that this is consistent with this view of capacity to adjust and shed workers. I noticed that I have a little bit of time. This is just to mention that we do the same exercise for SARS, just to see if you want the primitives that we're using to take the pandemic to the stock market to firm performance was there in a previous case. And we do find the similar results, that this change in the predictions, or the change in the cases is negatively associated with the performance of the stock market. And just to allow for time for question and answer, let me conclude. In this very preliminary paper, we're using unanticipated news about the trajectory of the pandemic to forecast stock market returns. And we find that this has an important effect in terms of the exposure of firm yields to the pandemic. We do document that there's some important financial market reaction to an expected crazy growth, leading to important declines in the stock market when there are unexpected changes. We argue that the firm level exposure is linked to the ability of firms to cut some costs. And this explains this, if you want, dichotomy between the stock market and the labor market. As I mentioned, we have next steps to do. We're waiting for the new data. And so we're going to expand our work using this new unemployment data. We also want to decompose the firm returns by channel of exposure. And we, of course, want to do more robustness to our work. And so let me stop here to allow for questions.
Thank you very much, Laura. And we already have here a question from Andy Powell, so I'm going to give him.
Actually, before I allow 2 questions, I don't know if my co-author wants to add something first.
You are mute, Anusha.
As Laura said, this is extremely preliminary work, and the gist of it is that we're trying to use the unexpected information in new case arrival as a measure of disease progression as the disease progresses. So that's our news measure, is if the model is predicting something and the actual cases that are reported are either more or less, that is our news measure, and we're trying to relate it to stock returns at both the market level as well as at the aggregate level, and then constructing measures of exposure. So, I'm happy to be here and help to answer questions. Thank you.
So I'll allow Andy to talk.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Hi, Laura. Nice to see you. Thanks a lot for the presentation. Very interesting. So I had a question. So when you model the curve and then look at the unanticipated changes, when there is an anticipated change, do you then in the cases, do you then update the model? I mean, is the model kind of being updated continuously over time? So in a way, the market, I mean, I guess the assumption is that the market is then sort of updating its beliefs 100%, right? Given the next bit of information, the market is updating its belief by that, whatever that new information gives you, right? So I'm wondering, I mean, there's clearly a lot of uncertainty. So that said, the previous model was wrong, and now there's a new model, and everybody believes the new model, right? Or the parameters of the new model. But there's clearly a lot of uncertainty, so it's not obvious that the market would update, you know, accordingly. So I'm wondering if you had thought about incorporating some sort of model uncertainty explicitly, so then the market updates, but not, it doesn't update 100%. You see what I mean? You know, it gets some new information. It's then has to incorporate that, but it's not clear always how much weight you should put on the next piece of marginal information. And sort of related to that, I mean, I think the market had been behaving extremely positively, which of course may have changed today. And that seemed to, I mean, one hypothesis that's to do with the reduction in uncertainty, that the curve seems to have become much more predictable. And so the changes in the model, I'm sure, if you update the model, the changes in the model are much smaller in the second period. So I was wondering if you had thought about that. But thanks so much for the presentation.
So go ahead. Do you want me to take it or? So Andy, that's a great question. And we've been thinking about this in terms of the model uncertainty. And one thing that has been suggested to us is to look at the actual sort of rate of change of information arrival. So incorporating some sort of volatility or uncertainty into our estimates in terms of how we're predicting the disease progression. Because here, when you see the exponential function, for example, to the epidemiological model that looks at the exponential function that uses that, it's basically just sort of telling us the rate of change and how it sort of stabilizes over time or flattens as the disease trajectory also flattens. And so the idea would be related to what you're saying is to incorporate some sort of volatility measure, which is to try and see how incorporating uncertainty in information arrival affects our predictions. Because as you said, the model is continuously being updated, and that's why we're calling it in real time. So if new case arrival, based on new case arrival today, the model is going to be re-estimated, and we're going to have a new slope or a new sort of trajectory that is projected out based on the new arrival today. And then there's new arrival of information tomorrow, and the model is going to be adjusted again. But you're exactly right that something that would help finesse our predictions is basically incorporating some sort of volatility that would take account of uncertainty. And the nice thing about this feature is, as Laura showed you, there are times when the predicted cases are lower than what the model had forecast, and there are times when the number of predicted cases are greater than what the model had predicted. So in the first case, it's good news about the disease and the pandemic. In the second case, it's bad news about the disease and pandemic. And what we see is that, as Laura showed us, as the market was tanking, that's very sort of inversely correlated with disease progression. So as the disease was becoming worse, the market was tanking. At a certain point, it started to flatten when all the lockdowns and so on were taking effect. And at that point, we started to see the market stabilizing. And then what we see today, and we're updating the model up till now, the present time, is that today there was bad news. As the economy has started opening up, more cases are coming out, Memorial Day, the protests, etc. And what we see is that the market is reacting negatively to this negative information about case arrival. However, we also want to belabor the point that we are by no means claiming that this is the only game in town. This is the health shock. It seems to be the most salient feature that's being factored certainly into stock returns, but we also know that there's a lot of, policy interventions. So that's a horse race that remains to be run.
Thank you, Anusha, for the answer. So now we have Ernesto Stein. Ernesto?
Yes, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks for the presentation. Very, very interesting. So I have a few questions. So you are drawing information from the substantial changes that occur between the predicted number of cases and the actual number of cases. But when these changes, especially when the changes are large, many times it's not simply that there's more infections. Sometimes it's because perhaps there were few tests available and suddenly more tests become available. That is good news. You have more information, but still you will have a spike in the number of tests. And this will be a surprise. Then you can have a change in testing protocols. Maybe you were only testing at the beginning people who had traveled to China and to Italy and to Spain, and suddenly you eliminate that requirement from the testing protocol, and so you're testing more people. I'm wondering if, for example, the proportion of tests that are positive also has information in this regard. And also, many times there are big adjustments in the number of cases. For example, I don't know if it was early May, New York suddenly increased substantially the number of COVID-related deaths because those that had died with probable COVID were counted as COVID, and perhaps I would imagine those were counted as cases as well. So once in a while you have these big jumps in the number of cases that will be surprises, but they don't reflect the number of people who got infected today. They affect like changes in how many people got infected in the past, but today you're starting to officially count them. And on top of this, I realized looking at the data that there's a lot of volatility depending on the day of the week. Sundays and Mondays tend to be much lower in terms of number of cases and deaths in particular, at least, compared to every other weekday. And so I don't know if this is something that your model takes into account or not. Thank you.
So Ernesto, that's you're making some very valid points. So additional sort of extensions of what we are doing is to actually try and look at this percent positive, right? Because that is actually conditioning on a base of how many tests were conducted. So far what we've been doing is that we've been taking the Johns Hopkins data on the case arrival, and that's the information that we have been running with. But you're absolutely right that, one of the issues is that these testing protocols, there's a lot of variation across states. And one idea would be, and Laura alluded to this in her presentation, is that when we see that, the stringency measures are not coming out significant in our estimations, but we know they had an effect on, the disease, the path of the disease progression, is to actually go to the state level data and then basically look at, the percent positive and include that. What I've seen for North Carolina is that they are reporting the percent positive, but they're not doing it on a daily basis. So what they're doing is, let's look at the total cumulative number of tests so far and how many are positive. So you'd have to sort of infer that from the new cases that are reported anyway, and then sort of as a denominator, look at it as a percent of the tests that were conducted, and we'd have to go state by state to get this information. So that's one point, but it's very important because, and this is also something that Laura was talking about, the SEER model and other epidemiological models require a lot of information that may not be available in real time. So, the thing that is hitting the market, and I know I'm doing this every night, is to kind of look at how many cases were there in North Carolina today. And so that is sort of a simple metric that is providing us with information, but you're exactly right that there are other metrics that are actually taken into account in more complex epidemiological models. And the other one that we've been thinking about, which is actually interesting, is because you can infer infection rates, is the death rates. So the reported death rates, and you're exactly right that there are all these issues of things that were reported as COVID deaths or could have been COVID deaths, et cetera. There's all this uncertainty in reporting, but as time goes on and there's more clarity, that's another metric that we could incorporate, is how is the market reacting to death rates.
Let me just reemphasize that is precisely the reason why we chose to use simpler models. All that you mentioned, which is important, in February, March, was just not available. There was not only not available, there was no clarity of the differences across states, counties, on all of this. For example, Massachusetts, it originally just reported cases, much later started to report tests. Once they decided to do more tests, they started to show the tests that they were doing. So all of this was not available, and there are the revisions. That is precisely the reason why we chose to go with the simpler. Now, there is a different type of analysis, which is a horse race. Which of all these more complex models will predict even better the stock market? But so far, we again, the results, I think, speak for themselves. It seems to do very well in terms of explaining some of these changes, but also the leveling off, which is related to Andy. It does seem that once the investors manage to put risk into this, in terms of the type of distribution, the market leveled off. When it was uncertainty, it was reflected in results all over.
Thank you, Ernesto. Thank you very much for the answer. So we have a question in the chat before going to another question. So we have Carlos Ospino who's saying that it's a very interesting paper, and says, your interpretation is that investors penalize firms that are not able to shed costs. Did you explore differential labor market regulations, dismissal, furlough, UI, at the state level, and or bankruptcy regulation or regulation affecting capital adjustments? Thanks.
So, yeah, Carlos, this is a very, very interesting question. And in fact, that's what we've been sort of thinking about, right to work states sort of exploit geographic heterogeneity in terms of labor market flexibility. To see if that is driving the results that we see on the market value side. So these are really great suggestions in terms of labor market regulations, et cetera, and other sort of regulations. And I think in time we will be able to exploit the cross-state variation in order to kind of add to our results. So thank you for that question.
Andy has another question, but I'm gonna take advantage and ask one question that I have. And is if you thought about analyzing the role of trade credit and also how the supply chain among the different sectors work, and which is what you're expecting there.
Laura, you wanna answer that one?
Literally, that is it. The next step we have been collecting all this client and supply data. So we want to exploit that supply network. Apart from the delays of working from home, which I would argue is not as efficient as people make it sound to be, there are two issues that have delayed a little bit of work. One is that the unemployment numbers, we were waiting for them to be able to map geographically better. The other one is I got locked out of CompuStat at HBS because I had to go use the terminal. So that delayed a little bit of our work, but literally that is in our to-do list, the supply network.
Looking forward to see it, to see the results. So now I'm gonna give again the microphone to Andy.
Yeah, no, I only said to come to me if there was time, Victoria. I was, only if there's time. So it's apparently there is time, so that's good. Yeah, actually my question is a little bit related to the question by Carlos, because I mean, and you started off saying at the beginning something, Laura, about the asset pricing models not being very good or something. I can't remember exactly how you put it, but I was just wondering to push you on that, because I mean, there's clearly many things that are going on, right? So, I mean, there are some firms that are benefiting from this situation in extreme cases. And there are many firms that are, I mean, different firms are being impacted in very different ways. So it depends on the sectors, how easy it is to work virtually. I mean, there's a whole host of features. I mean, I guess you could try to do something by controlling for all of that, by sector, by geography, by, whether it's, I don't know exactly, but you could sort of follow all that route, right? But then there's another question which I had, which is, also, I mean, this has impacts on the overall stock market. So you think that this is related somehow to systemic risk, but it may also, of course, affect preferences. So I'm wondering, are you sort of thinking more about going this first route and saying, well, the value of these firms is all changing because of all these factors about how firms are affected by the situation? Or are you also interested in thinking about how these valuations change because, thinking more of an asset pricing model kind of way, we now have a COVID factor, right? An additional factor, let's say, and firms may have a different beta to that factor, which would also be another way to kind of think about it.
So Andy, that's what we do, right? So the beta that Laura showed you is the beta to the COVID factor. That's what we're using as our measure of exposure to COVID. And you're exactly right that the asset pricing framework is the way to go in terms of what we are doing right now is we just have two factors. We just have the market and we have the COVID factor. We haven't done a full-blown asset pricing model with the standard market book, firm size, momentum, etc. But I think the point that Laura was making right at the beginning is that markets have a very hard time, and I've heard this over and over again from my friends on Wall Street, is that markets have a very hard time at the beginning of recessions or in times of great volatility. So right after 9/11, during the global financial crisis, right at the beginning, it's very hard to forecast cash flows and discount rates. And that's exactly what you need in an asset pricing framework to see how the expected value of future cash flows changes due to different factors. And what we are finding is that even in this time of high volatility, something that's popping out as very salient is the health shock as measured by the unexpected news about this new case arrival. So even in this time of uncertainty, what is being priced is the health shock. And I think as time goes on, I think there's another paper by David Esmar, et cetera, that do a sort of Campbell-Schiller decomposition to look at whether it's cash flows, whether it's discount rates. And we've sort of taken an approach which is much more, looking at the cost side, looking at the supply chain side is our next step. But the questions that are eventually going to come up are what's happening to demand, or you alluded to preferences and so on. But essentially what you're asking is what's happening to the present discounted value of expected future cash flows. And hopefully as time goes on, we'll be able to disentangle the two channels as you would using an asset pricing model.
Thank you very much, Anusha. And being 4:01, I'm gonna close the seminar and thank all the participants, and special thanks for Laura and Anusha for presentations and answering all the questions. It was a great pleasure to have you here, and I hope to see you all in the next EconNet that we will have. So thank you all. Bye.